Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Esme, and I'm a producer for the How To Academy. Thank you for tuning in to this free Inkspots event with Isabella Tree. Isabella is an author and a conservationist who lives on the UK's earliest rewilding estate. She's going to be speaking today about what that means, if you don't already know, why it's important, and how you yourselves can help protect our wonderful environment. After this, Isabella's going to be answering your questions. So whether you're interested in becoming an author or you're keen to get stuck into protecting the wilderness, please ask lots and we'll get through as many as possible. So please join me in welcoming Isabella Tree.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to try and share my screen now and show you some images. This is my book, When We Went Wild, and I'm so excited that it's been published, my first children's book. It's the story about a couple who run a farm and realize it isn't working and they decide to rewild. It's inspired by my own experience, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our own rewilding project, how we went wild and what our land now looks like, and the wildlife that has come back. So this is our rewilding project at Knepp. I'm going to try and play a little bit of a video clip, but it may be a little bit shaky, but I believe you can actually get this sent to you by the How To Academy, and so you'll see it in less shaky form. But this is our rewilding project at Knepp. It's 3,500 acres in West Sussex, and we've simply turned it over to nature. People, when they come here, find it very difficult to describe because it looks so unlike anything else that we're used to in the English countryside. It looks a bit like Africa. You kind of feel when you're walking through it that a leopard or a cheetah could jump out at you from around the corner. But this is now some of the most important habitat for wildlife that we have in the UK. We have nightingales, purple emperor butterflies, peregrine falcons, all incredibly rare species. And certainly my husband Charlie and I, when we began this experiment to rewild, to turn the land back to nature, never imagined that our land would end up looking like this, would end up looking like Africa. The very soil beneath your feet feels alive. And in the spring, the bird song, even if you go out in a morning like this morning, very early, the bird song is so loud that it kind of reverberates in your stomach and your lungs. It's this amazing feeling of sound reverberating. This is what most of our land looked like 20 years ago, just before we gave up farming and embarked on rewilding. The problem was that our farm, our land, sits on really heavy clay. It's about 300 meters of clay. And in Sussex, we have 30 different words for mud, words like sleech and slob and stodge and swank. Our world is defined by what this earth can turn into in wet weather. It just turns into unfathomable mud. And that means that you can't do intensive farming on it all year round. You can't get machinery onto the land in winter to sow your spring crops or to do any maintenance work. And this means that you can't compete with other farms on much better, richer, loamier soils. So we struggled ever to make a profit from farming on this land. And after 17 years of trying our hardest to make the business work, we were £1.5 million in debt. We owed the bank £1.5 million. We had to make a decision to do something different. And so we decided to give up farming altogether and do something completely different that would work with the land rather than battling against it all the time. So this is what happened. We sold all our farm machinery, we stopped ploughing, we took up all the fences, we stopped spraying chemicals on the land, and we simply allowed the trees and the shrubs to grow up. And we smashed up all the drains that had been trying to keep our land dry for farming. And suddenly we had ponds and wetlands appearing, which are fantastic for biodiversity. And then we released free roaming animals back into the land to start creating new habitats for wildlife. So what these animals are doing is they're behaving like the herd animals we used to have in our landscape in the past before we hunted them to extinction. So we often think of the past as closed canopy forest or something, but we've forgotten about all the huge herds of free roaming animals that would have been out there disturbing that vegetation, knocking down trees, gnawing through bark, ripping through thorny scrub, creating much more open habitats. And so we used to have a creature, an amazing animal called the aurochs, which is on the top of the picture here. This is a cave painting in France from 17,500 years ago. It was a giant ox, and this is the animal that we get our descended cattle from. Our domesticated cows come from this original ox, but we hunted it to extinction. But we can use their descendants. We can use cows to do pretty much the same job. And this beneath is one of our Old English longhorns from the project at NEP, doing a very good imitation of an aurochs. You can see how similar it is in size and scale. And of course, it's got those amazing, amazing horns. And so an Old English longhorn will eat in exactly the same way as an aurochs. And it disturbs the ground in the same way. It transports seeds in its gut, just like an aurochs would. And the longhorn, because it's an old hardy breed of cattle, can survive outside all year round. So we don't need to give them extra food. They find everything they need out there in the rewilding project. And the interesting thing is that cows don't just eat grass. Originally, they were browsers as well. So that means that they'll be eating twigs and foliage, sometimes gnawing bark off trees in the winter. And this is a hugely important interaction with vegetation. And then, of course, their dung and their urine makes the soil rich and fertile again. Another animal that went extinct is the tarpan. Again, a cave painting of it up there. It's the original horse. And because we haven't got tarpan anymore, we also hunted them to extinction, but we have got their descendants. And this is an Exmoor pony, which looks incredibly like an original tarpan must have looked. And it's also a very hardy breed that can live outside all year round and ostensibly become a wild animal again. And so Exmoors are out there in the project doing very much the same thing as the cattle. They're disturbing, they're browsing, they're feeding, but they eat totally different things. So they'll be eating all the rough grass that the cattle can't stomach. And that will enable the sweeter, softer grass to come up that the cattle can then benefit from. They also like eating things like thistles, which the cattle just won't touch. So they've got very different preferences. And if you have different species like these in a landscape, they all do different things. And that all adds to the complexity of the habitats you're trying to create. And we've also got 3 different types of deer. So we've got roe deer and fallow deer and red deer. And again, they've got different mouthpieces, different vegetation they like to eat, different ways they disturb with their hooves and their antlers, which they often toss in the branches and use to turf up the ground in the rut in the autumn. And finally, we've got Tamworth pigs. These are my favorites. They're behaving like the wild boar that used to roam Britain. And it's just amazing how these animals behave when you're not used to seeing them doing this. Who would have thought a Tamworth pig would behave like a hippo? They love being in the water, and quite often they'll dive for roots and acorns that have fallen to the bottom of ponds. So they're really instinctive, ingenious, curious creatures. And quite often we forget that about farm animals. Certainly as farmers, you know, I was used to seeing our cows in a field doing quite boring things. You know, they would just had their heads down, eating grass, not doing much else. And so I thought they were perfectly nice creatures, but they were pretty boring. But of course, it's not the animal that's boring. It's the location, the place that we're putting them into that is boring, where they just don't have the chance to express themselves naturally. And that's what's amazing when you see these animals that have come from farmyards and you're putting them into a rewilded area, how amazingly expressive and intelligent and adventurous they seem. And of course, the pigs are doing a really important thing for us. They're rootling up the soil, and that allows the grass to be opened up. So you've got damp earth that seeds can then fall into, or if they're in the seed bank, they can open up and wildflowers then colonate that area. So you can see in this little rootle spot here where the pigs have rootled that all these other plants have come in. And it's a much more complex patch that now than just the grass around it before. And of course, it's being colonized by all these lovely native flowers that we tend to call weeds. And I've tried to make it a promise to myself that I'm never going to use the word weed again, because these are our beautiful little native flowers and we have zero tolerance for them. When they pop up in our gardens, we take them out. but these little native flowers are incredibly important for insects, for butterflies, for pollinating insects, but also for birds that use their tiny seeds, which are really high in protein, to get fat on. And if we lose these wildflowers, which is increasingly what's happening in our landscape, particularly when we mow our verges and even our urban areas and our parks, then we are really impacting wildlife in a bad way. So at NEP, we now have all 5 species of British owl, including the little one on the left there, which it's called a little owl. And it is a beetle specialist. And it's really thriving at NEP now because we have so many dung beetles. Because our animals aren't treated with wormers or chemicals or antibiotics that then get into their dung, which then kills any insect that comes into contact with that dung. The cattle dung, the pony dung, the dung of the deer is fantastic for attracting insects. And it attracts dung beetles in particular. And dung beetles are keystone species which bring the dung back into the soil and make it fertile again. So these cowpats are now thriving with dung beetles. And that's why the little owl is so prevalent here, because it loves eating the dung beetles. My husband Charlie has a bit of a thing for dung beetles, and for one summer he got really fascinated with them, and he used to bring in cowpats into the kitchen and rummage through them and find out how many dung beetles he could find in them. We weren't terribly impressed when we were sitting down for breakfast having to have our toast next to a patch of dung, but my husband thought it was really fascinating, and he managed to find 23 different species of dung beetle in a single cowpat. And we've now got 13 out of the 18 British bats that we have here, and some of them are incredibly rare. This is a Beckstein's bat, which is rare even in Europe. And one of the most amazing creatures that have come back, and none of these we've introduced, they've all found us because the habitat is now there for them, is the purple emperor butterfly. This is our 2nd largest butterfly in the UK, and its amazing behavior. It's not like any of our other little pretty butterflies, which sort of land on a flower and sip nectar and are very delicate. The purple emperor butterfly is a bit of a bully, and it can actually chase birds. It can be really fierce and territorial, but it also likes eating very stinky, smelly things. So quite often you'll find it alighting on fox poo or something like that. It likes eating a bit of fox poo, but it also likes getting drunk. And so it will land on an oak tree that has a sap run on it, where there's a weakness or a cut, or perhaps even a lightning strike, and you've got sap running out of the tree, and it's alcoholic. And so these purple emperor butterflies will literally all cluster onto a sap run and get wildly drunk. They're amazing, amazing creatures. So our story, Charlie and my story at NEP, was really the inspiration for my book When We Went Wild. Nancy and Jake, the main characters, are made up. Nancy is named after our daughter, and Jake is the name of my godson. But to tell the story in a very short book like this, I had to make it much, much simpler. So this is really based around a fictional couple who perhaps have a small upland farm that they have also made a decision to rewild. But essentially, the story is the same. Nancy and Jake were on land that simply wasn't suitable for normal intensive farming, and they couldn't make money from it. So they had to do something different. They were really unhappy, and their animals were unhappy too. And I love Alira T, the illustrator who did this book with me, because she's so good at getting the really sad expressions onto the cows, and particularly the pigs with their sort of floppy ears. They're so dejected and miserable. I think it's absolutely brilliant what her pictures do. But when they decided to rewild, amazing things began to happen, just like they did at NEP. And their animals became much happier and much healthier too. And again, you can see the pigs in the water, just like they do at NEP, looking for acorns. You can see their ears are pricking up and they're all looking alert again. The cows are even jumping and using their muscles, which they can't really do in farm systems. Everything is springing back to life. The neighbours weren't so happy though, and this was very much from our story. When the neighbours in the book see what Jake and Nancy are doing, they're very disgruntled because they think of it as messy, as irresponsible. There's I love the titles here: wildflowers ruining the landscape, too much nature in the country. And these are the sort of objections we had from neighbours and farmers around us. I think they simply didn't understand what they were seeing, because it was so different to what they were used to. And they couldn't believe that it was either good for wildlife or that ultimately it would be good for them. So I think very much rewilding is about changing a mindset. It's allowing yourself to understand a different way that the landscape could look, and freeing up your mind a bit to become messier. So at one point, with all this criticism from the neighbours, Nancy and Jake thought they might have to give up on wilding altogether. But I won't spoil the story. I can let you discover if they managed to convince the neighbours to change their minds, and if so, how they did that. But that is for another story. And if you want to read about it, you can read about it in the book. But I'd love to answer any questions if you have them.
Hi, Isabella. Thank you for doing that. That was wonderful. I had no idea about the purple emperor butterfly. That is amazing. I love the idea of them being the kind of boxers and the animal kingdom. We do have lots of questions. Our first question is from Mila. And first of all, she wants to know, how many animals have you got?
That is such a difficult question to answer. I think we have in 3,500 acres, we've got about 400 head of cattle, 400 longhorns. That includes the little ones. We've probably got about 300 or possibly 400 fallow deer. We've got I would guess about 50 red deer, and probably about 30 Exmoor ponies. And the pigs, I mean, I think we have probably about 5 adult sows, or maybe 6 adult sows, but they've all had piglets, and I have no idea how many piglets are out there at the moment. the numbers go up and down.
I'm so jealous of you having Tamworths. They're so beautiful. Mila's asked lots of questions, and I'm going to ask all of them because they all deserve answers. She wants to know, does rewilding have anything to do with climate change?
It does, and that is such a totally brilliant question. Well done. I mean, you know, we're talking to policymakers, and I'm trying to get this message across the whole time. If you do something for biodiversity, for nature, you're essentially restoring the soils, and you're allowing vegetation to come back. And all of that sequesters carbon. All of that brings carbon out of the atmosphere, into the soil, into the trees, into the vegetation, even into the grass. And interestingly, if you have animals grazing and browsing in that system, it also stimulates the plants to grow deeper roots. And the roots too will be sequestering carbon. So you have the right number of animals in a big enough landscape. They will also be helping that process of sinking carbon into the soil. And that is what is going to help combat climate change. So absolutely, I think nature and restoring nature is the biggest, if perhaps the only way that we can combat climate change.
That links on perfectly to a question which we actually slightly spoke about earlier from Natalie, who's 7, and she wants to know, should all parks be turned wild then?
Yes, Natalie, that's a totally brilliant idea, because, and some of them are, I mean, in London, I've noticed recently that some parks are leaving a lot more longer grass, rougher edges, so it's not all mown all the time. And that means you have lovely wildflowers, not weeds, coming back. So you've got lots of insects. And if you have lots of insects, you'll have lots of birds, you'll have lots of habitat for small mammals. So there's definitely a lot that can be done there. And in our gardens, for example, we can have hedges instead of fences, you know, between us and our neighbours. We can perhaps put in a pond, which is always fantastic for wildlife. And generally, it's about getting a bit messier. It's about leaving that patch of nettles or brambles, because that's also fantastic food for insects and butterflies and moths. Allowing some dead branches to stay where they are, because lots of beetles will eat dead wood. Lots of creatures love dead wood. So we do, sometimes doing less is doing more for nature. And if we can persuade people, including the councils, to allow our roadside verges and our parks to be a bit messier, not with litter, but with wonderful habitat of long grass, dead branches, patches of nettles and brambles, that will be so much better for wildlife.
Well, Mila also wants to know, how do you think we could help rewild? So I'm assuming she means that on an individual level. Is there anything you can do at in your homes or anything that might help?
Absolutely. And I think anyone who's got a garden, a backyard, who even if you've got plant pots on your doorstep or a window box, you can help nature. And the way you can do that is, first of all, by going chemical free. So not using any artificial fertilizer, not using pesticides or herbicides. Basically, if you go to a garden center, almost anything you find in a bottle is bad for wildlife. It's a complete irony. You think you're creating a wonderful garden, and actually you're creating something that is probably very inhospitable to many insects. So not using pesticides and herbicides, perhaps growing your lawn, if you've got a lawn, allowing that to grow longer, doing a no-mow May, leaving your lawn perhaps even until September to mow. Again, leaving your rougher patches, not panicking if you suddenly get aphids or black fly on your vegetables. You know, if you wait long enough, and it may mean waiting another year or two, another pest will come in, another predator, either an insect or a bird, will come in to eat those insects. So you can get a lovely sort of natural process going of natural predators controlling the pests in your garden without having to use pesticides. But it's also about choosing plants that are great for pollinating insects. Wildflowers are also lovely, and we should have more of those. Persuading the council to have wildflowers on our verges and not mow them all the time. So it's that sort of thing. And also connecting with neighbors, because if you can connect with your neighbor and persuade them to put a little hole in your hedge or your fence for hedgehogs, then you can become a wildlife corridor, and you'll have hedgehogs going through your back gardens, which is wonderful. You know, it's all about connecting and getting the areas of nature bigger.
That's a phenomenal idea. I love the idea of a hedgehog corridor. Another question is, did you love the environment when you were younger?
I absolutely did. And I lived in a sort of, I think it's a generational thing, but, you know, when I was growing up, you know, gosh, back in the 1960s, so I'm 55 or 6 now, you know, I was allowed to roam free. You know, at weekends, I would just disappear. And as long as I was back for tea at 5 o'clock, sometimes I wasn't, I could do anything I liked. And I had my spaniel Bustle and my chopper bike and friends, and we would just go off anywhere, and we'd build dens and light fires and cook, you know, eggs and bacon. And so it was really quite a feral existence. And so I love nature, and I love making dens and getting to know my wildflowers and the birdsong. And when I grew up and went to university and lived in cities again, I missed that hugely. So now I'm loving it, and our children have grown up not quite as feral as we were, but they've been able to wander around and camp outside and all of that. So yes.
Gosh, sounds wonderful. Sounds like you're a member of the famous 5 or something.
I always longed to be one of Swallows and Amazons. I was always Nancy in the Amazons when we were.
Well, yeah, the name was passed on. An interesting question, actually, which was, how long did all of this take?
Amazingly little amount of time. That's what's so exciting about it, because if you think that in 2000 we were still really that scene I showed you at the beginning of that ploughed field, you know, pretty much all of Knepp was like that 20 years ago. And now it looks like Africa, and we have some of the rarest species in Britain. So we're now one of the most important areas for nature in the whole of the UK, and that's happened within 20 years. So it's nothing really. And if you think where we are, we're underneath the Gatwick Flyway. We've got big roads all around us. We're in busy, populated, developed east of England. If wildlife can pour in here, it can happen anywhere. So I think it's really exciting. If we just give nature a chance, it will bounce back.
Another question, which is picking up on the fact that you were one of the early pioneers of rewilding, which was, how did you learn about nature? How did you know to do this and to go back to the, sorry, I live on a busy road. If only I didn't. How did you learn to do this and give power back to nature?
Well, I suppose the inspiration came from a Dutch ecologist called Frans Vera, and his ideas are influencing a lot of rewilding projects in Europe. They've got really big, amazing rewilding projects. If you ever have a chance to go and see them, they're absolutely astonishing. And it's what his ideas really were saying, that we don't need to know how to manage nature. We just need to put nature back in control. And so one of the ways of doing that is restoring natural water systems, because they're very dynamic and they will create habitat for you. But it's putting those animals, those large free roaming animals, into the system. And of course, one animal I didn't even mention, which is called a keystone species, because it is so brilliant at creating habitat, is a beaver. And we are going to get beavers here this autumn, which is incredibly exciting. But so the animals really manage nature for you. And the thing about rewilding, which is so different to conventional conservation, or how we human beings tend to think anyway, because we're such control freaks and try to manage everything, is that we just put these drivers in the system, these free roaming animals, the dynamic water systems, and then we just sit back and let go and let nature work it all out. And so there are no targets, there's no goals. You're not trying to get, a particular species back. All you're doing is trying to get nature functioning and happening in a very dynamic way again. And that's what's fascinating, because quite often unexpected things happen. And if you're happy just to sit back and let it happen, it will all work out fine. And that's a wonderful feeling, because it takes a huge burden from your shoulders. I don't have to be responsible and controlling everything all the time. Nature is much better at it than we are.
Isabella, that's all we've got time for today, and I think that's a phenomenal place to stop. Thank you so much for telling your story today. And also, I'd like to say to everyone, if you enjoyed listening to this, go to Knepp Estate. You can visit Izzy in Sussex. Izzy, that was wonderful. I've learned so much, and I feel full of joy to go out into the wilderness for the rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lovely to talk to you.
And thank you everyone for joining and listening. Have a great rest of your weekend.